Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this term time, lunchtime event. I'm really pleased to be able to put this together, opportunity with LSE Ideas. We've got little platforms we can put on events like this. I'm really glad to be able to do that. Right? Those of you I don't know, it's good to see a lot of you that I do know here. I'm Dr. Aaron McKeel, where I work at the LSE Ideas and the International Order Research Unit and the Strategy and Diplomacy Executive Master's Program as well. I'm really pleased to introduce and welcome Dr. Jay Williams, Director of the Carnegie Maxwell Policy Planning Lab, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Associate Professor at Syracuse University, as well as LSE Ideas Associate, and also a graduate of the LSE International Relations Department PhD program as well. So it's really nice to welcome you back. Thank you for joining us. That's right. He is an expert on NATO, transatlantic relations, security, strategic studies. I think the major book would be Law, Science, Liberalism, and the American Way of War, Cambridge University Press, and a large number of articles on that topic. So today we're here to talk about the revolution of warfare. Warfare is rapidly changing on the battlefield, and we're all trying to catch up, as it were. So we're really pleased to welcome you to learn about how things are developing on the ground in practice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Yeah.
So it's a real pleasure to be back here. I spent many years in London, over a decade, and now I live in Lower Canada, or split my time between Lower Canada, Syracuse, New York, and New York City. The talk today is on, I guess you have that slide there. The revolution is still coming. In the advertisement, I mentioned Yemen, but the paper has largely focused so far still on Ukraine. We can talk about a broader engagement with conflict if you want to in the Q&A, but I'm going to focus predominantly on Ukraine and on land warfare. I'm cognizant, Aaron said we have plenty of time, but remember, it reminds me of an old story where there's a professor giving a very long lecture and everyone was wilting in the room, and he said, "I'm so terribly sorry, there isn't a clock at the back of the room to know how long it's gone on." And one of the participants says, "Yes, but there's a calendar behind you." So I'm going to try and keep the comments to about 30 minutes, and then we could have a discussion. Has the utilization of drones in the Ukraine war heralded a revolution or evolution in land warfare? In July 2023, Google founder and technologist Eric Schmidt wrote in the Wall Street Journal that the future of war will be dictated and fought by drones. He went on to assert that for Ukraine to win this war, it needs to, quote, rethink 100 years of traditional military tactics, focus on trenches, mortars, and artillery, end quote. Schmidt's reality-obscuring enthusiasm is not new. Observers constantly describe the warfare of their own age as making a revolutionary breach in the normal progress of warfare, wrote Cyril Falls, the Chisley Professor of Modern Military History at Oxford in 1953. He went on to write, "It is a fallacy due to ignorance of technical and tactical military history to suppose that methods of warfare have not made continuous and on the whole fairly even progress." The war in Ukraine is no exception to Professor Fall's assertion, but rather a confirmation. The realities of the war have thus far proven Mr. Schmidt wrong. Drones have assisted in Ukraine's defense, as well as Russia's assault, but they have not revolutionized war, at least not yet. The war represents an evolution rather than a revolution, and much Ukrainian success at the outset can be attributed to Russian failures rather than revolutionary technology or employment of such technology. At the end of the day, if one country wants to invade and occupy another, it still requires basic material of war, soldiers, tanks, and artillery. Land can't be occupied from the air with drones, and although drones are evolving the battlefield, we've yet to see changes in doctrine and force employment that would herald a truly revolutionary advance. They are thus far a complement rather than a replacement for more traditional military technology. So what I want to do for you today is outline briefly the history of the revolution in military affairs, which some of you may know about, some of you may not, and then compare the theory of the RMA to the conduct of the current war, particularly the first year and a half of the conflict. And finally, I'll conclude in looking at how drones and other technologies such as AI may possibly impact future doctrine and force employment. And I'm going to apply that to the U.S. Brigade Combat Team, which there will be lessons for British military officials who want to draw upon those. Much ink has been spilt in writing on the revolution in military affairs. Notions of the RMA, as we like to call it in the West, date back to the 1970s and actually Soviet writing. In the Soviet Union, military theorists were expected to identify and theorize about discontinuities in the character of war that may lead to fundamental change. Burgeoning new technologies at the time, such as electronics, laser, kinetic energy, radio frequencies, electro-optic, remote control, and particle beam technologies were all what these theorists were considering. And the Soviets were particularly seized in the animating features of essentially computer-assisted decision support systems. So to us, this doesn't sound like anything new, but this is, again, the 1970s, right? So they were, we'll see, very far ahead of their time in thinking about the battlefield of today. They thought that these computer-assisted decision support systems could, quote, potentially extend the depths to which future systems would operate, close quote. This would be through the use of precision-guided munitions in particular, okay? So we'll come back to this. These theorists thought that the battlefield would become increasingly complex, right, and very in-depth, and the kind of forces participating in land warfare would also change and evolve. The cause and concern for the Soviets was the susceptibility of Soviet military forces in Cold War Europe to NATO strike forces. So by the middle of the Cold War, the 1960s and the 1970s, Soviet military doctrine was based on echelonment. Not sure if anyone's heard that phrase before, which basically was an arrangement of military forces towards a rearward dispersal. So the Soviets saw if they were to mass forces at any one point on a NATO border, NATO nuclear forces would be able to target them and eradicate the whole force. And so they were already at that time thinking of multiple echelons dispersed further away from the front line, because this is an era, and what we see in the war today is there is no front line, right? But this was still the thinking about of a front line and a rearward deployment. And so dispersed rearward forces that after an initial punch through by the forward echelon, follow-on force doctrine, as it became known in NATO, they would go through, right, and they'd be able to mass quickly from disparate positions. So this would sort of nullify the ability of NATO to make a massive nuclear strike on one area, because the idea is that you have to concentrate your forces to push through a defensive line, right? So this led to a changement of Soviet doctrine, the NATO nuclear forces. Now, this, of course, created the problem for NATO, right, which had used nuclear forces in the 1950s to overcome their conventional force deficit, right? So as the Cold War starts to hot up in the late 40s, early 50s, the NATO forces realize they're greatly outgunned. Nuclear weapons come to the rescue, right, providing the ability to sort of negate the massive conventional force numbers. The echelonment strategy then in turn sort of negates the notion of being able to punch all the forces out in one heavy blow. So then NATO goes back to follow-on force attack, right? Which essentially is adopted by 1981 within the NATO Military Committee. So the Soviet theorizing about implications on how the US and NATO would fight was far ahead of what the Westerners were actually thinking about. So the military technical revolution becomes the RMA within Western thought based on captured documents, right? So this wasn't thought up first by the CIA or by any Western military. It actually was taken through espionage initially. But even though they were reading the documents, in particular a 1974 document called Scientific Technical Progress and the RMA, it wasn't until the 1980s that American theorists began to think about the implications of the revolution in military affairs. Krapenovich was one of the first and wrote in 1992 that to realize their potential, technology central to the military technical revolution must be incorporated into military systems or munitions. Because of the nature of this revolution, the ability to integrate military systems into and across networks of systems or system architectures will be of great importance if they achieve a dramatic increase in military effectiveness. So at the same time this theorizing is now happening within the United States, we also then have social and global order changes, right? So the Cold War ends, the Soviet Union collapses, and we find ourselves in the so-called unipolar moment, right? Where American force is unquestioned. And before the full onset of this happens, there is the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1991. So for those of you, most of you look like you were born after the Iraqi invasion, aside from a couple of us, in 1991. Iraq seizes Kuwait for its oil fields in what we think is a bout of confusion. He actually thinks he was perhaps empowered to do this from the Bush administration, who says, no, 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 you're not. In any event, the George H.W. Bush administration assembles a vast international coalition to oust Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. The aerial bombardment started on January 17th, 1991, and Kuwait was liberated just over a month later. The ground campaign lasted not more than 100 hours, and the rout was seen as heralding the revolution in military affairs, right? But there are challenges and I think problems with this argument. And there have been doubters of the RMA for a good 20 or 30 years. I'm sort of in the doubter category, and I'll explain why. So first of all, Iraq was not a peer competitor of the United States, all right? US, UK, and French troops greatly outperformed the enemy and did have better technology. But moreover, Operation Desert Storm was not a precision war. Most of the bombs employed were dumb bombs. They were not precision munitions. The IT infrastructure and sensor technology utilized was largely non-functional. And so for all sakes and purposes, the 1991 ground campaign against Iraq was essentially a little faster, slightly more precise version of air-land battle. Air-land battle was U.S. Army doctrine for the better part of 2 decades, from 1982 into the late 1990s. The doctrine focused on close coordination between land forces acting in an aggressive maneuvering defense, with air forces attacking rear echelon, feeding those frontline forces. So this, of course, air-land doctrine was predicated as a counter to the echelonment strategy advanced by the Soviets, right? And I would actually go on to argue that essentially, although we've got numerous doctrines that have been published, essentially what we have today is still largely air-land battle. So what happens, though, is that enthusiasm for the supposed RMA, which is supposedly seen in Iraq, leads to sort of whole-scale transformation within the U.S. Department of Defense. A particular disciple of this was Donald Rumsfeld, right, who wanted to implement as a cornerstone of defense transformation the notion of network-centric warfare. The aim of network-centric warfare is networking of sensors, commanders, and shooters in a military hierarchy that is flattened, right? And the goal of this is to reduce the operational pause, thus increasing the op tempo, enabling more precision and more speed of command. This would lead to what Rumsfeld would call shock and awe, right? So the idea is network-centric warfare would lead to shock and awe, and that the enemy would be so stunned by the speed and rapidity of the attack, they would actually just collapse in place, right? You wouldn't necessarily have to defeat them in a decisive battle. Interestingly, this shares intellectual roots with what in the Western world is called blitzkrieg. It's not what the Nazis used to call it, but it was similar, right? The blitzkrieg strategy was predicated on avoiding a massive battle of annihilation by racing through so quickly and disorienting your opponent that they might actually surrender rather than fight the battle, right? So we focus a lot in military theory on decisive battles, but winning battles doesn't mean you actually win the war. It's actually getting people to surrender that makes you win, right? So shock and awe had a similar logic to it, that the enemy would be sort of stunned and would sort of fall by the wayside. But the enabling technology was, again, microcomputing, right, networking, and IT solutions. Now, the trouble is that the RMA, which Rumsfeld was instituting via an Office of Defense Transformation in the Pentagon, ran aground on the reality of insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, both of those wars, it's sort of funny, the RMA, I think, makes those wars in the first instance seem doable. And this is where we go back to my last book with my colleague Stephanie Carvett, right? Is that the RMA promised what Paul Starr calls an easy war. And again, the initial the rout of the Taliban in 2001, largely using special forces and some precision munitions and technologies and early drone for surveillance technologies. And then Iraq, we're seen again as signposts of superiority and the actual revolution. I would again argue here that neither of those were pure competitors, and that if your metric for success is defeating Iraq, which yes they had lots of tanks and they had soldiers, but it's really not a first-rate military. Never mind the Taliban, which was definitely not a conventional military, right? So again, I don't see those as signals. And if you look at the way the campaign in Iraq was fought, again, it's basically air-land battle, right? It's airstrikes with racing forward, ground, armor, and infantry. So those quick wins were seen as less shiny because of the insurgency. And instead, the focus became what Christopher Coker and others have called wars of risk management, right? And so I think it's important here, too, to interject a note about presentism, right? What you see time and time again, and I think it's across the discipline, whether it's about international order or military theory, is this notion to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, this is what all future war is going to be. And so around 2005, 6, 7, 8, everyone starts saying we no longer need these heavy, militaries that can, with artillery and tanks and this airland, but we need deployable forces. We need more special forces. This is also, by the way, a route I always grimace when I hear Americans complain about European force structure and the lack of Europeans to defend Europe, because Europeans were pushed for the better part of 2 decades by American military planners to get rid of artillery and to get rid of tanks because Russia was done. There was going to be no more great power war in Europe, and we needed to focus on deployable forces to go do all this risk management, or less kindly, imperial policing, right? So I think what I'm talking about today, I advocate moderation. You need to, especially state powers need to be able to fight multiple types of conflicts. You're going to gear around a dominant conflict, but arguably we've seen that peer versus peer state competition is not gone, and is certainly going to be a feature of the modern world. And some of these lessons are applicable to, say, more regular conflicts. They're not wholly related. So what do we see then in Ukraine? So the RMA goes sort of out of fashion. The Office of Defense Transformation is quickly closed by the end of the 2000s. It's still being pursued, right? But it's largely, again, U.S. military forces have not gone in that direction. They're focused very much, this is the age of Kill Cullen, right? And the notion of counterinsurgency warfare. So Ukraine, emblematic of revolution or evolution. An analysis of operations in 2022 and 2023 indicates that the revolution is still coming. And I should focus here, I don't know why I bothered putting together slides, never managed to work them properly. We are focused, by the way, here on the operational level, or the operational art. So the catchy title says war, but I'm really focused mainly on land warfare in this slide deck. So what do we see here? Put the map up, it'll be more useful for you. The war represents an overlay of traditional military force and planning, or lack thereof, with an admixture of new technology resulting in tactical adjustments, but no large-scale doctrinal change as of yet. So we've not seen a whole-scale rethinking, which would be emblematic of a revolution rather than an evolution. I do think we may see a truly revolutionary change in the next decade or so, but this will be driven as much by social change and circumstances as by technological change. And I think that's one of the things that's often missing in a lot of the American writing on the military revolution, is it's always technology premised, right? So they focus on breech-loading rifles versus muzzle-loading muskets, right? They focus on the rise of air power, but they tend to neglect things like the rise of nationalism in the nation state, which enabled the creation of larger armies to serve a national cause, right? Rather than what were previously smaller, actually professional militaries. So the social element takes precedent. I think that's one of the chief problems we'll see going forward, especially for Ukraine. So the stalemated nature of the current war and the losses incurred on both sides, I would argue, are more symptomatic of poor planning and blunder than they are technological employment. Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine was predicated on a successful special services campaign to destabilize the country, not on major combat operations. And there's been really great reporting, but also more detailed analytical reporting out of RUSI, Jack Watling, CRS, RAND. There's and I'm not going to go in depth on this, but there's a lot of great studies if you want to go a little more in depth on this. But it's pretty evident that their initial plan, as you can see in the map here, was to actually destabilize the regime. It was a bit of a shock and awe. They assumed, right, that the Ukrainians would crumple, that they'd be able to decapitate the regime and get in place, and that everything else would become a fait accompli. Now, of course, the problem here is that Russian ground forces were ill-prepared. They got instructions very late. They also don't have a culture of entrepreneurship, right? So they didn't really know what they were doing, how they were doing it, and as they started to proceed apace, they all went, and they weren't going in battle or combat formations. They were moving basically in sort of getting from A to B, right? Like just get down the road there. So they weren't actually operating in a combat manner. They were moving in what's called administrative columns. And so what happens is the Ukrainians, having had almost a decade of experience, are better placed generally, especially around Kyiv, to offset the Russian advantages in conventional forces. And so as Russia continued the offensive and the fighting became more contested, there was a chance that Kyiv could have fallen, but it did not. And the Ukrainians contested on all axes of attack. They did better in the north as opposed to the south, where they had fewer artillery pieces and emplacements, right? So again, we see the old school technology, which we've been told for 20 years is no longer relevant, is actually playing a major part here, right? The use of cruise missiles, the precision for the rear strike element, becomes critical here too, to take out those artillery pieces, enabling Russian advancement. So Russia then changes its strategy. It's no longer a coup de main, right? It's no longer topple the regime. It's actually trying to annex, which I think a lot of people had assumed, myself included, in full disclosure, would be the overall goal originally. So I was very shocked when the whole thing started. I remember talking with a Ukrainian student, and I thought it would make sense to have a contiguous portion to Crimea. This would make total sense, right? When the whole attack happened, I was a little dumbfounded because it didn't really make a lot of sense. There were also assumptions by most Western analysts that the Russian military was stronger, better prepared, and operationally capable than it was. So this first phase, we see very limited use of drones. We do see more employment of cruise missiles. We also see no attempt at air superiority by the Russians, which is a little odd. And to this date, no one has achieved air superiority over Ukraine, which is problematic. As they begin to redeploy, medium altitude, long endurance drones are more used, but they also are quickly degraded. Right? So from both sides, what we see, instead of drones being used as strategic weapons, which is how they've been utilized mainly in a NATO platform and for force protection, they're actually used for reconnaissance. That becomes their overarching purpose. Reconnaissance and target acquisition platforms for artillery. All right. So what are the takeaways from this brief summation? And again, I recommend to you, if you want to, the CRS reports, the CNAS, RAND have all got great in-depth studies about this. So I think the first is that the battlefield, the fog of war and the haze of the battlefield has been greatly reduced, right? And this is a problem that again goes back to that Cold War doctrine, right? Where they could already see the placements, but moreover now, the ability to set up a rear command structure, supplies, doesn't work. You're visible pretty much everywhere. And so what happens is command posts, supply stockpiles become targets, right, in this information-rich environment. And so concentration is an absolute weakness. So this is, again, a problem that was in there in the Cold War, but has been magnified extensively, right? And so what it does tell us, and we'll go into this a little more, is that UAS, so uncrewed or unmanned aerial systems, that's different, by the way, than a UAV. So the UAV is the vehicle. A UAS should be thought of as the system. And that system entails both a vehicle and an operator. So again, and we could talk a little bit about AI. We're not sure to what extent it's been used or how it's being used on either side. But it's still very much a human-machine system right now, right? And this will have implications, I believe, if we truly do revolutionize how we think about combat deployment, how we organize a brigade. We'll get to that in a little bit. So what else is there? Electronic warfare then becomes critical, right? So what we've seen is that both Russian and Ukrainian forces have been using everything from simple barriers and nets to capture drones to consistent electronic and persistent electronic warfare. Now, this doesn't mean destroying a drone. It means messing with its operational ability, right? Confusing it, rendering it not useful, right? So it doesn't mean you're downing it, although they do that, but just it's continual interference and disruption. And so the electromagnetic spectrum must be continually contested. Now, right now, a lot of this capacity is with air forces and naval forces and not with actual ground units. And so I think this is one lesson for us. We'll be employing that and we'll talk about that in ground units. Now, one of the other things we've seen, as I mentioned, those higher cost, long endurance platforms than the military platforms, which have given Russia an advantage as the war has gone on in longer strike with drones, which the Ukrainians don't have, is, however, the drones don't need to actually be survivable, which is what we've predicated the West, a lot of our technological thinking on is survivability. It's actually just rapid production. So you sort of flood the battle space with cheap, more disposable drones, right? And I think this causes a real challenge. And you can see the US certainly, which I'm following a little more closely. I used to follow the British more closely when I lived here. They're trying to do this startup and incubator and partnering with civilian platform makers to make smaller drones faster and more cheaply. But there's a lot of challenges of how our procurement model works. And so the drones are vulnerable, but massing the drones, basically mass production, enables them to be sent into the battlefield at a rate that kind of wears down your enemy. What we've seen, though, is that the mass production and employment of the drones has not been done in swarms, right? Stacy Pettyjohn wrote about this in a great CNAS report, and she comes to a similar conclusion as I do about evolution, which is we actually see drones operating in stacks rather than a swarm. So a swarm is going to have a bunch of drones that are operating autonomously, semi-autonomously to overload a system. And what we're seeing is actually these team units where essentially both sides are using operators with software-based battle networks and both commercial and some military platforms, right? And so it's really a vertical stack of operations, that system I mentioned to you, as opposed to a swarm. So those are the plus side of the drones. What about the downside? Well, the drones do not match the potency of traditional artillery or tanks, right? Which the Ukrainians have often used as almost mobile artillery placements. So they supplement and they get enhanced because they allow you to have better visibility. But a howitzer packs a far bigger punch than a drone. So artillery barrages remain a feature of the battlefield. And it is, again, as I kind of went through here, and trench lines, right? This is not that dissimilar if you want to go and Google a World War I trench line, right? That doesn't mean it's a static war. People think trench lines are static. There's still maneuver happening, but you're seeing a lot of things that are not as revolutionary as one would think, right? So drones matter, but they still don't outpace the actual utility of artillery and armor. And of course, you have to occupy the place, so you do need infantry at the end of the day. Second, drones provide more affordable air power for combatants, and Ukraine is done particularly well on the commercial side of this, but you still need air forces. I mentioned that no one has achieved air superiority in the war. The Russians have done a decent job of conducting effective suppression activities of air defenses, but they've not completely taken out or disabled Ukrainian long-range strike capacity, right? So both sides remain susceptible. So air power still matters here. Air forces around the world will be happy to know this. But I do think one of the lessons will be breaking apart drones from just being controlled by air forces. So what does this mean for our doctrine? What does it mean for a warfare? So first I want to talk a little bit about warfare and what the thinking is in the US, which is kind of an evolution of network-centric warfare, and then talk about the brigade combat team and how it might actually revolutionize things. So right now, the term in the US is something called Mosaic Warfare. Has anyone heard of this? No? So Mosaic Warfare takes its name from a mosaic. You've probably seen a Roman ruin, right? And a mosaic are little tiles, and they're different colors, and when they're all arranged, there's an image, right? And when you take it apart, there's no image. And so they're using this as a way of thinking about battlefield units. So and basically that can be disassembled and are independently something, but can be compiled to be something larger, and ideally could make different images, right? There might be one image it makes, but the mosaics can be, let's say you lose some mosaics, you can then take them apart, they're independently a thing, and then you could reassemble them to make a different image that you would use, right, in conflict. So why do we need this mosaic warfare? Well, let's think about the implications of the usage of drones in Ukraine. And by the way, these networks are both commercial and non-commercial. This is, I think, one of the issues is the commercialization of the battle space, which we've yet to grapple with. Russia legally could strike Starlink. That would make sense. They're facilitating combat operations. And then, of course, is Starlink covered by Article 5? I don't know, right? So there are actually big follow-on. I'm working on a piece on Article 5 in space with a student right now. So there are some really big implications from all this. But sticking to land warfare for now, degrading information flow becomes critical, right? So in any attack against the U.S., a peer competitor is going to try and do this, right? Degrade U.S. information flow and isolate. So I try to isolate information from the opponent. Targeting. So the enemy will target high-value nodes, right, in your combat network. So what the Russians have seen is they traditionally set up rearward command posts, just like NATO has done, just like Brits and Americans have done. Those are now no longer invisible. And so you really need to have much more mobile command posts. We'll come to that in a minute. So essentially, that you don't rely on whole-scale command and control. The U.S. Army's been conducting exercises already where they utilize smaller command posts that could be set up in about 20 minutes. They're also piggybacking on commercial communications technologies, so you no longer are setting up these huge antennas and dishes, right? It's really changing. It's not been implemented, but they've been conducting tests over the last year and a half to basically make smaller command posts. If you look at the statistics on command fatalities of Russian forces, it's astronomical. And that's largely from the first part of the war before the Russians, and by the way, the Russians have been adapting extremely well. I think in the U.S., my sense is that there's two things at play in the U.S. They either disparage the Russians all the time as, oh, they're rubbish, or overestimate Russian capacities, right? And so in the beginning, it didn't go so well, but the Russians have adapted very quickly. And what you do see is this constant cat and mouse between Ukrainian and Russian forces in innovating and then someone adapting, right, and then having to innovate again. So information dominance, targeting of high-value assets. The operations become predicated on disrupting the system of collaboration, right? So thinking again about this mosaics, it's like each unit has to be able to collaborate within itself and move around rather than a hierarchical command formation. And then, of course, speed. Distorting and extending the time sequence for the operational tempo gives you more time to either get away or to attack, right? So trying to disrupt so confusion and chaos within their communications network. And so Mosaic Warfare offers the potential to overcome this sort of fourfold approach to modern warfare. The idea is that the mosaics are resilient and that essentially they are individually highly capable, high-end systems that are entrepreneurial in nature, okay? And so these enable you to bypass that slowing of the kill chain and to keep it up by being able to reconstitute very quickly. So what we see here is that in a mosaic operational construct, the point-to-point chain is replaced with a web that's connected through sensors and essentially is continually updated upon a common operating picture. So what's in the past, what we've thought about is integrating everything by high worth nodes, the F-35, right? That's what that is. And so it's a single expensive platform. With Mosaic Warfare, what you're actually doing is disaggregating it and spreading it across numerous platforms, including unmanned platforms and lower value platforms, okay? So I would argue there's actually a lot of similarity. It evolves from network-centric warfare, which sort of kicked out a few years ago. And in this way, Rumsfeld was quite revolutionary in his thinking about war, right? But we get caught up in the presentism of, oh, it doesn't apply to an insurgency, and so it gets left by the wayside. But when we look at this peer versus peer conflict, we see actually that what they were thinking about 20 years ago is actually coming into play, but without real doctrinal change yet. There's been two doctrines since, but it's really not much actual change. So what would this mean in terms of changing actual force usage on the battlefield? So let's consider the brigade combat team. The brigade combat team is the dominant formation within the U.S. Army. It consists of 3 infantry battalions, an engineer battalion, an artillery battalion, a cavalry squadron, and a support battalion. Okay. The challenge here is that it's, again, a hierarchically controlled entity, and it relies on essentially training up the electronic warfare capability that you would need inside of the system, right? So the enablers, critical enablers as they're called in military speak, you would before deployment, right, have time to bring them into the force, train them up in a training progression, and then deploy with them. But that takes quite a bit of time and is not reflective of what we see now. So what I would propose, and this has been written about a bit elsewhere as well, I think makes sense and would be more revolutionary, is getting rid of one of those infantry battalions. Why infantry? Well, you wouldn't be getting rid of all that infantry battalion, but you free up around 700 to 800 spaces, right, within your combat formation. And what you would be doing is you'd be adding some additional infantry to the other battalions. However, you'd be focusing on those critical enablers, right? So in a multi-domain operation, you're going to need air defense, soldiers specializing in electronic warfare, which is what the Ukrainians have seen, right? The operators with their goggles. And so the priority really of the brigade combat team is to put infantry on point. But in order to put infantry on point, you need to be able to operate in this multi-domain and complex battle space, right? And so by reducing the number of infantry you have, it's sort of better forces rather than more forces, right? You need to be able to counter the constant electronic warfare, and you need to be able to utilize your own basically air assets, right? So instead of we talk about joint, right, doctrine. Well, this is actually, I mean, the Air Force will still be playing a role, but this is literally joint within the brigade combat team. So the soldiers, this is what we see in Ukraine, they will be employing their own air systems, right? That are not, that don't belong to the Air Force, that aren't operated by the Air Force, right? They're especially for this more low-level tactical decision-making. What this also does is allows the United States brigade combat teams to build back in special troop battalions, which focus on signal and military intelligence, right, within the force. And so you fill the capability gaps, and you don't rely on the back, right, command center. So you're kind of, it's really becoming an entrepreneurial unit, that Mosaic, that can move around and be utilized when necessary. But I think the entrepreneurial nature, and this is what we've seen also with Ukrainian forces, that Ukrainian forces, having been trained by Western forces, were more able and willing, and there's a number of Russian problems here, to think outside the box and to respond. The Russians earlier on especially sort of got their orders, executed orders, and didn't deviate from them. And so they didn't really learn in place, which is partly, I think, the way the Russian military trains and operates, and it's much more hierarchical, and they don't want to question what's happening above them. And so I think that Western forces and Ukrainian forces have had an advantage in this. But again, critical here is you still have to have the manpower for this to operate. And I think that's one of the major social changes that we're seeing too, is that technology will enable change of the brigade combat team, right? So to slim down that infantry element, add in more electronic and this sort of stacked capacity in ISR and drone employment on the battlefield, but you still have to have people within this system. And I think the social driver is both for Ukraine, but also the United States, Britain, and other NATO allies, is that people don't want to really fight anymore, right? And so in this like postmodern world where we live, where people have fewer children, life is very sacred, people don't really want to join the military, the U.S. Army has not hit any of its recruiting targets for the last several years, right? And this is at a time when the U.S. military is ostensibly almost at peace, right? For, you know, so, and they're not meeting them, right? So those recruitment challenges become an issue. And this is one of the reasons why a reformation of the brigade combat team, it's not just about what we probably need to do to survive in a pure battle situation, but also what we need to do to overcome both budgetary constraints as well as manpower, person power constraints on the battlefield. So I'm going to wrap up here. The conclusion, of course, is that this is evolution. I think the elements for revolution are there, but revolution would require whole-scale change. And what we don't really see, and it's, even in the ensuing year, I was focused mostly on the first year and a half, is that it's tactical advantage, but it hasn't resulted in any large-scale strategic change, and there's been no large-scale reconceptualization of how warfare is fought. So the tools are there for it, but whether or not militaries do this remains to be seen. It does look like in the US these are being tested. Fort Drum, there's testing going on up there, and then also down in the southeast of the United States where they're playing around with these doctrinal changes, but none of them are, it's still right now a 3 infantry battalion brigade combat team. So I'm going to end there and turn it over to you all for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I think the first question is, for me perhaps, how are the Russians adapting, right? I think that one's quite interesting, right? So we've got this Mosaic Warfare entrepreneurial unit being developed, and is this kind of just a Western-centric thing? How are illiberal powers adapting to this new type of warfare?
Yeah, great question. So the Russians have been using a different approach. I mean, the Russians also have different considerations than the U.S. has. So, you know, the book I did with Stephanie on science, law, and liberalism in the American way of warfare is that Western countries, Ukraine included, but you know, Britain, the United States, European allies, we care about, although it doesn't sometimes look at to some observers, we care about people on the battlefield, both our own soldiers, but also civilians in the battle space. And so when we're utilizing technology, we do so with an angle, right? One, we're trying to offset often manpower advantages or disadvantages. But we're also trying to do so within a liberal context, like a respect for life. Russian forces don't do that. I think it was Jack Watling at RUSI who coined the phrase like the Russian meat grinder tactics. Although sometimes you read so many things you can't remember who said it. I think it was Jack. But that's what the Russians have been doing, right? So they've adapted in terms of the employment of drones. They're also using commercially available technology. They very quickly took that up. They're doing the same sort of things the Ukrainians are. It's gone down the force structure. They have also made their command centers are much more mobile. So they have learned from all this, but they also still have this more old school approach of throwing ensuing waves of soldiers that they've just taken from, say, jails, right? And they're drawing largely from the hinterland of Russia. They're not taking anyone from their prosperous cities in Western Russia. And so they're kind of pushing the conflict to the periphery there. So you see change in some of their operational thinking, but you also see sort of this old school throw more people who are disposable at the problem, which the Ukrainians can't do. I mean, the Ukrainians have been trying to, so what you could be critical of the Ukrainians is that they've not drawn up large-scale forces which are necessary to really fight the Russians. But the Ukrainians have consciously chosen, because the average age of a fighting Ukrainian soldier is like around they're in their 40s, right? Late 40s, not in their 20s or 30s. They're trying to shelter their young people. Because what they've seen is that every successive generation of younger Ukrainians is better, more productive, more Western than the older generations. And so it's a little, I don't know, Machiavelli, but it's actually quite clever. They're like, we need to shelter those younger people because they're the key to the future of a prosperous, innovative Ukraine in Europe, as opposed to, you know, and I think the older folks are up for this too. They recognize that to protect the youth rather than throwing them all into this meat grinder. But they still have a manpower challenge there, right? So that's what they're trying to overcome with the technology. But the end result is you still need to have the technology, the manpower, and you still need to have that old school military technology, howitzers and tanks. And again, the Russians have vast stockpiles. It's dumb. It's not super advanced, but if you're just throwing wave upon wave of older Cold War tanks, right, of older artillery systems into the field, the Ukrainians have much more limited numbers because they've exhausted their older Soviet stocks and they've received a lot from the West, but they haven't received enough, and so they're caught in this place. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah.
So there is some change, but you also haven't seen a wholesale a revolution of the way the Russians fight war either. But I would argue it's fundamentally been different because there hasn't been necessarily that respect for life in the Western way of war that you find in U.S. and Western ways of warfare.
Terrific. Okay, let's open up to the moon. Let's see some hands up for those who are interested. 2 up front. We'll start here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you for the amazing presentation. First of all, now, if one was to try and play devil's advocate here, right? So main point is, asymmetry brought forward by drones causes brigades to have to be able to react more entrepreneurially, and thereby less infantry, more electronic warfare, more drone operators themselves, right? Because of the increased amount of cheap information that can be achieved on a tactical, immediate level. You say instead that the Russians still have a very top-down hierarchical system that is, in my opinion, inherited from the Soviet era, where they had this equation-based approach to warfare, right? We have X artillery, X shells that we can disperse over an area that is XY, and we can expect this force concentration, right? It's a very mathematical equation-based system, which then forces them to be more hierarchical. Couldn't then one argue that, especially because of the enhanced ability to collect information on a immediate tactical and subsequently operational level, that this very top-down mathematical approach to conquest makes sense, right? Because it means that you have better information to input within your equation system that implies in better prediction and thereby better operational efficacy. Couldn't someone make this claim?
Yeah, definitely, for sure. I think what you've seen, so I agree with everything in terms of how you explain how they think, how they approach it. This is also why the Russians were very susceptible to deception in the beginning, and they still are, right?
Seekers, as an example.
Yeah, they get super, and so what would happen is like there'd be a destroyed airfield early on, and then the Ukrainians would basically print out large scale covers of like a blown up airfield and then put it over other airfields. And the Russians, because of the way they were looking at everything, and everything's like this, it's not from the side, there wasn't human, right? And so they were, but that's the whole point, is you can fool the hierarchical, mathematically based system. And I think that's what this gets down to, is that if it's too hierarchical and it's coming just from sensor technology, I mean, human's been huge for both sides, right? And the Russians have had better placed human as the war has gone on as well, to actually know what's going on. And that's also where the lower level drones come in, because if you're using just, like in the Cold War, it was obviously much far removed, right? But, tactical drones, you can actually see at a size, you'd be like, oh, that's a tent. That's not actually, right, an image. It sounds crazy, right, in 2024 to think that printed tarps, but they really worked really well. So I think that their method of war is much more susceptible to that, which is what reduces the potential efficacy, and that's what this whole Mosaic Warfare tries to defeat, right? Is that disrupting their information flow. If they're following that model, you're disrupting their information flow, you're trying to deceive them, that hierarchical structure won't function. And if it's all looped into that, then you don't take out, but you reduce greatly the efficacy, right? And then maybe it kind of reconstitutes. But that would be my answer now. I think that actually it's not as useful. The other thing the Russians had a problem with is that the Russian the brigade tactical groups that they had didn't work particularly well, because they relied on components being stuck in, and when one was degraded, they didn't just add in, but they removed the whole thing from the battlefield. So there's another angle there, but I think for the hierarchical structure, that the whole point is to kill the information, and that's where the continual electronic warfare comes in, at the campaign, at the land battle level, right? So.
Great, thanks. Very good.
Yeah.
Cool, so the question's pretty much hinged on Mosaic Warfare, which is new to me. So I'm sure, as you're aware, the British Army, our doctrine still is very much manoeuvrous warfare. I've not personally heard Mosaic Warfare talked about as much in the UK, apart from in Russia and sort of various things.
Yeah, it's still quite niche.
What are your reflections on how the two methods differ? And with a particular focus on where does Mosaic Warfare have the upper hand, that manoeuvrous warfare, noting the current threat, wouldn't necessarily be sufficient.
So I think the difference is the centrality of the command, and again, the hierarchy. So in Mosaic Warfare is, I would argue, a variation on maneuver. It's still, I don't think there's been, again, going back to that, all the way back to the Second World War, like what we do today is actually, slightly more modern version of rapid maneuver warfare, right, with air support, with attacking rear echelons, and forward and then rear. So I think that what it does is that the traditional notion is one centrally controlled force, right, with sort of all the same information, and it acts in a singular direction. I mean, you can have different units on different axes of attack, as we saw, but it's still all kind of centrally controlled. And what I think the Mosaic Warfare is about because if your communications are taken down and you're centralized, your network is, this is the point, is if you have a network, you can take out nodes, but then you reloop, right? And in traditional maneuver warfare, it's still sort of one, pick up a telephone and call for it, or one computer, one command center. And so what you actually do is you set out with a joint sort of overall plan for everyone. And if people lose connectivity, they can operate at lower levels independently. And so it basically breaks down, they continue to operate, but they're not reliant on a rearward central control facility that's directing everything. So everything we were originally saying, like information up, and the notion was, that what we saw in the 90s and the 2000s was this control from way back. Even the presidents and prime ministers were involved, right? And saying, oh, we can see it, and then relaying. Now it's kind of devolved control, right? So it's maneuver warfare, but devolved to these individual sort of brigade combat teams, the Mosaics, and if they lose connectivity, they're not, right, they can't get back to communicate with the overall commander, they operate independently and proceed on an axis of attack. Does that make sense? So it's really about the ability to, and then they could reconstitute, but it's not about a centrally controlled sort of attack. And if you look up, there's a bunch of stuff out there now, like War on the Rocks, Rusi has a bit, so it's pretty new. It's like the last 2 to 5 years it's sort of been out, but it's still percolating around.
So, hand with the hat.
Just a quick one. So are you making the case there then that Mosaic Warfare does represent a revolution as opposed to an evolution in warfare?
That's a good question. I haven't decided yet. So this is one of the first times I'm doing this paper. It's for a book that James Rogers out of Cornell has put together, and I guess the question, I think it would, because it would be a massive, I think it's a bigger break than air-land battle doctrine, right? It would actually, we're just talking about a brigade combat team. So then I think we'd have to think about broader employment, right, through Mosaic Warfare. But I think it has the potential to constitute a revolutionary change rather than evolutionary. But everyone makes their whole career on RMAs and evolution or revolution. So we can talk in 10 years. But I feel like it could be actually much more revolutionary. And for me, too, the human component's integral to it, because I think that it's about overcoming that challenge of diminished manpower, right? And people not wanting to fight as much. So it's about, and that's the thing, it's not about getting rid of infantry at all. It's just making the infantry you have more useful. And in an ideal world, we'd say, oh, just add add another battalion on of the electronic warfare and key enabler and engineers. That's what we do in an ideal world. But assuming the Britain especially, assuming you can't just add resources, and even in the U.S., so assuming budgetary constraints, but then also the manpower constraints, that I think will shape it up, right? And then you layer on the AI, which we haven't talked about, and that's, again, AI has the potential for those units to process, and it's commercial AI, like Palantir has been doing a lot of the targeting for Ukraine. So you then have these more localized units that are actually sort of fully independent of a real command, which could lead to a lot of challenges too. So I think that it would be revolutionary. But
Can I ask a follow-on to that then?
Sure, we have lots of time today.
Okay.
Yes.
So if revolution, you're saying, so doctrine would represent a fundamental change in the resources, the equipment, the training, and the deployment of those things in the battle space.
yeah,
Strategy is the use of the available equipment, training forces in battle space. So a revolution needs to be a pretty massive change in
Wholesale
both
change.
doctrine and strategy.
yeah.
And you're saying you're not seeing that in the Ukraine example?
No, I think we're seeing indicators of like evolution, but not massive doctrinal change yet. I think it's there. I think that's why the U.S. Army is testing some of what I just told you about, right? Because when we think about, even within NATO, right, we're thinking about mail and hail systems that are, they're centrally controlled. We're deconflicting airspace parameter. Like it's very different, right? And so I'm actually thinking about it in a Western context. I still think it's evolutionary on the battlefield, but I think someone's going to take all the bits and pieces together and then truly revolutionize something within the next decade. This is like the same thing as the First World War. Like everyone thinks the First World War was a largely static war. It wasn't. There was actually quite a lot of maneuver element to it. But it was taking bits and pieces, right, of what was happening in the First World War and then basically the German High Command, right? Learned like, okay, let's try this employment of this, right? And I think that's where we are now, is that we're looking at it. And of course, it's really hard to have a revolution while you're fighting the war. I mean, the Ukrainians have been tremendous, like taking up what they have, but I don't think it's resulted in a whole-scale restructuring of the force, right? And you haven't seen that in the West either. I mean, going to your question, right? Like Western militaries are kind of still in the same formations that they have been historically, but with a little more precise weapons, more overall visibility, right? But the question is, what happens when that visibility is cut off, right? If it's all hierarchically organized, right? And I think that's where then you've got to get, how does that change your command structure, the relationship, the higher command, entrepreneurship on the battlefield? I think then it gets more revolutionary, right? So I think we're on the cusp of that, but we'll see. I don't think it's happened yet.
Great. I had a hand up first there. Yep.
So, thank you. I'm not an expert, so maybe my question is a bit more general, and it's twofold, and it's about possible US-China engagement. The first one would be, how is China, to the best of your knowledge, responding to this evolution in its own structure? And the second, even more general probably, what's the likelihood, seeing that there is a lot of adaptation during war conflict in Ukraine, that this revolution, that the passage from evolution to revolution will happen during the conflict itself? And
in a conflict with China?
yeah.
So the first thing is, great question. I mean, the first thing is a different battle space, right? So for all intents and purposes, I'm really just focused on land warfare here. I think that when it comes to US-China, it's going to be more of an air and sea war, which is going to be very different, but not entirely. I mean, I was a little shocked at one point to learn, I think they've changed it, but a few years ago, I think a decade ago, I was in Annapolis, and I was talking to some naval officers. And I'm a sailor, by the way, so like a regular sailor with a sailboat. I was talking to them about, carrier battle groups and naval forces. And I was shocked to learn that at this time, I think it has now changed, that I assumed that in a carrier battle group, there was at least one person on that aircraft carrier plotting manually the location of the fleet, right? There was not. Come to find out, there aren't even charts on everything's electronic. There were no paper charts on the aircraft carrier or any of the ships. I was like, well, so I'm like, if I'm an enemy, my first thing would be to like try and make you blind. I mean, I don't know about you, but I can't. I came to LSE like 2002. I used to have an A to Z. Do you even know what an A to Z is? Anyone here? No, A to Z is this book that us old people used to carry around. He had a little grid, and you said, I need to go to Houghton Street. And you looked up the back, and I said, go to page X, grid X, Y, and you look, and then you have to figure out how to get there. It's we all carry these books, amazing things around, right? So, but you could get around there. It didn't matter about this. It didn't matter whether you had service. It didn't matter if, whether someone was following you. I mean, the A to Z was yours. No one knew where you were going. So I was like, well, if you want to render a naval fleet ineffective, wouldn't you take out all of its ability to communicate with GPS and like make it blind? And then if you're not tracking where you are on a chart, you actually don't know where you are in the ocean, right? Like, it's not like you're in the middle of London. You can go, oh, I'm at Aldwych. So, Houghton Street's that way, right? So there are, I think, applicable lessons here. By the way, they have apparently reinstituted charts, I think, on U.S. naval ships, and training them how to locate themselves, like at sea with a sextant, which was further than I had imagined. But I mean, even if you're basically charting yourself, and then you have that remedial training, you could figure out at least where you're located. But I do think there are lessons that apply. I mean, the problem is there's better signals disruption capability in air and naval forces. I think the issue is that conventional naval forces in a Taiwan scenario, like just try to make something plausible here, is that they are highly susceptible to missile attacks. So you have the same problem, similar problem on land warfare, is that the Chinese have several long-range surface-to-sea missiles. And if you tried to send the U.S. carrier battle groups are good for demonstration effects, but they're not going to be useful in any campaign to defend Taiwan. They are going to have to stand off so far. So in that sense, it's similar to land, where basically you have this, there's no frontline contact. And this has been a challenge since the rise of carrier warfare. I mean, used to have to be that you had to have your battleships right alongside, or your frigates, right, shoot your cannons, and then you had these, battleships. It's kind of the First World War, and then carriers are that strike over the horizon where you never see the fleet and they deploy their planes. But now the missiles know where the carriers are, and so you have to be beyond the range of those missiles, which makes them, they'll just sink in a battle over that. So those are the challenges there. But I haven't been focused on the naval elements. But there's also a lot of really, I mean, what's interesting for the naval elements, Ukraine's made great use of naval drones that basically sink almost the entire Russian Black Sea fleet, which is phenomenal for a country without a navy. And I think that there's a lot of this going on in the U.S. too. Like Thayer Mahan is a remote sensor system that's doing this. So I think we'll see more of that at sea, but it's also a different, I mean, it's a massive battle space. But I think what you'll increasingly see in an age of the sensor technology is submersible systems will be the most useful ones, right? Because those are the ones that are still difficult, impossible to detect. And in advent in quantum communications are going to increase their lethality and remoteness. So there's always this argument of, oh, actually, can they be found or not? But I think quantum communication advancement will make those submersible systems more difficult. I think the other lesson, though, that the Chinese have learned from the war in Ukraine was that if Russia had succeeded in their initial plan to decapitate the regime, I think the war would have been over in 6 weeks and McDonald's would still be in Moscow and Mercedes would still have dealerships there. And so I think the need to make it a fait accompli is what the bigger lesson they've learned, aside from all the other ones about doctrinal change. But I do think that they're thinking about how to disrupt our communications because we're so reliant on them. And in our traditional notion of network-centric warfare, it relies on these really high-value systems and more. It's already trying to go flat, network-centric, but it still has those critical key systems. And I think Mosaic is actually about, they're going to be part of it, but they're not going to be central nodes, right? They're going to be just part of a larger system. Sure.
Let's do two together. How about, two together.
Yeah.
So thank you for the presentation. It was super interesting. I just have a question on the topic of AI and its use in the military space. In your point of view, to what extent is the military today, especially in for great powers like the U.S., are willing to create multilateral agreements to somehow regulate the use of AI in the military to prevent rogue actors from using it for their own means and ends, but also to avoid any bigger issues that would sort of break the bounds of morality in the future?
Can I answer this on November 6th? Go ahead. You want to take another question too, or?
Sure. Yeah.
The Ukrainians I've spoken to who've been through British Army training really very dismissive of it now and saying, sort of, we just don't get it over here. To what extent, and militaries, Western militaries are normally very slow to adapt. We're always fighting the last war. To what extent have you seen that this is now, they've got it at a senior level and they're actually instigating this change beyond just sort of, testing a bit of sort of, Mosaic doctrine, etc.?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so on the frameworks, I'm not very hopeful for this. There's a few reasons. I guess one, are you talking about an agreement that would have the force of law in the U.S. or not, right? So the first challenge there, and I think this is a broader challenge for global governance, is that the United States Senate no longer ratifies treaties, basically. And so I'm not sure, because you need a 2/3 majority, I'm not sure that you could get an agreement negotiate with the United States president who say he was favorably disposed to it and then get it passed by the Senate. So you only have executive level cooperation that won't last past an administration or if an administration changes its stripes, right? So if Kamala Harris wins, then I'd say there's maybe more of a likelihood that that could happen. If it's a Trump administration, I highly doubt that it would happen. I think the overall probability is pretty low. And I mean, I think you see this with drones too, right? When there was a possibility of when the U.S. was the leader in drone technology about 20 years ago, and there was calls for sort of discussions about arms regulation around drones and how and when these might be used. The U.S. wasn't really interested in it, and also in terms of how they were deployed. I mean, even in the, I point out that everyone loves Barack Obama. I mean, I love Barack Obama, but in some ways, his use of drones was highly illiberal. Including target assassination of people with American passports. I mean, I would argue if you're waging a war with universal values, you don't want to target anyone. But especially your own citizens, right? Okay, they're a terrible person, but there was no due process. It was basically a group in the White House, saying, okay, who we should take out. So, I think that it was actually cut pretty liberal, and that was a Democratic administration. So I think that you don't tend to see an impulse towards this. And I think with AI too, that's the issue. And then the question is, how do you, maybe there'll be some sort of guidelines, but I don't know how do you regulate it, because it's also so much of it is happening in the private sector. So like, even if you were to say, okay, let's regulate, you can't really constrain. I mean, I don't think you can constrain them as much as you think you can. And so they're going to innovate, and then we're going to live in the world that comes out of that for the most part. That's a little pessimistic view. I have this meme I really like, and it says, like, science can teach you how to clone a dinosaur, and it has like an egg, and then in the next slide it says, but the humanities can tell you why that's a bad idea as the dinosaur chases the scientist. And I think there's a lot to be said about this, but most of these companies don't really have, I was sort of surprised to learn, they don't really have ethics teams on the inside. They view it as trying to control them rather than just thinking through the implications of their system. So like when Mark Zuckerberg invented Facebook, which is mainly so he could rank women, that's how it originated. He wasn't thinking about how it would upend, information and politics in the US, because you could just pick and choose what you were reading. So I'm not sure that they're thinking through all these implications. So that answers that. So I'm very pessimistic about it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but I'm very pessimistic. And again, another example, just a conventional, non-nuclear weapons too, right? Like we basically have no nuclear weapons frameworks left for the most part. Okay, the NPT is like hanging on. I think New Star's going to go kaput. And we can't get any agreement on that, right? And so AI is just, again, I think the commercial side of it too is there's so much there that people will race ahead, and then we'll see how it's adapted. So then about, rubbish militaries. So from what I've heard, the Ukrainians have also said this, and I think because it reflects where we are rather than where we should be. And this is the thing, is that innovation usually happens like you have your ideas, it happens on the battlefield, and then it's up to us, the military, whether they uptake the lessons and then really reorganize in advance, or they don't, right? I mean, so it's like the French defenses for the Second World War. I mean, they made sense in an old style war, but the Germans had leapt ahead in their thinking of their force employment. So it rendered it obsolete. So again, like I think a lot of our thinking is kind of dated, and in reading all these doctrinal documents, it's a lot of snazzy words and I don't think actual real change. I think it's like literally every cliched word you could write in, and there's no real change in there. And that's, I kept looking, I was trying to trace out like a change, like what do they call them? It was airland battle, that it was something, it was full spectrum operations, that it's all basically airland battle with fancy words. It's not real doctrinal change. And of course there's big risks to that, like if you do change it up and you kind of get it wrong, but that's what I think, that's what the Ukrainians are reflecting, is actually this is what needs to be done and how it's actually playing out. And we're teaching them to fight sort of airland battle with a little bit of tech added on. So that's why I feel like we're on the cusp of a real change, but we'll see.
Interesting. Harold has one in the back. Yeah.
What is the desired size, manpower-wise, for the U.S. military?
Oh.
What are the objectives for achieving that?
Yeah.
And how viable is the prospect of a draft?
Oh, great questions. Yeah. God, off the top of my head, I can't remember they used to want to, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, so I don't want to tell you the wrong number. I know that they're missing all their goals, right? And there's been a lot of writing about conscription and about a draft. And, I think that they would like to maintain the current size, if not grow the military. But again, I think there's the budgetary constraint. The thing is, the U.S. doesn't really have a budgetary constraint historically. They just spend more. So there just was a defense review that was done by an independent group, and their whole argument was basically spend more, which the U.S. can sort of do. At some point, that's going to be maybe a problem. But Britain can't do that, right? France can't do that. So the draft has been an issue. It's been come up again in the U.S. But I don't think that. I think that'll be really difficult, and that goes back to the social reasons. So, and I tend to hew to the cultural side of strategic studies, and I think this is true in America. I think European militaries were further into late modern era than the American military was. But I do think that Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm 45 this year. Those started when I was 22, right? 21, 22, and I think that people and the younger people who've been born into this and have only known that, I think they're pretty tired and fatigued and disillusioned with war in a way that they weren't necessarily 20 years ago. I think that there's a lot of cultural, because the RMA was all about how to make force usable. Now that there's no check on us, and it was this. I'm quite a big fan of Andy Bacevich's writing on the culture of American militarism, and it's really interesting to watch the films at the time and the triumphalism, and and then it was. I make my students. No one ever knows it, but Dolce et decorum est pro patria mori, right? So I make them read the poem by Wilfred Owens, which means that it is right and sweet and right to die for your country. But he does everyone know who he was? Or he's a British soldier who died at the end of the First World War. And the line ends with about basically how it's horrible to tell a lie for those who aren't zest in glory. That's rightful and honorable to die for one's country, right? And I think that's where a lot of American population is, and they don't want to fight. And I always say that if the United States was required to pass, so what they're trying to do is they want to avoid calling up too many people, because that links the population back to the military. They want to avoid taxing people for wars, which they also don't do, which gives them the most utility to use force. So I think that's the conflict. The civilians might want to use military force, although we've seen also change at the elite level where we don't want to be involved, and you see that on both sides. But I think even if those who advocate, who wrote, used to be at Garmisch, Andy Michdel wrote recently about this, right, about bring back national service and military service. But I think that doesn't capture where we are, right? People don't want to join the military and die for the most part. And even in the US, where they join the military, a lot of them are joining the military because they're from a poor economic group. They're receiving educational benefits. It's basically a social welfare mechanism. And that's a bit of what we also found when we ended up going to Iraq and Afghanistan, was these people who basically thought, and it's not a bad thing, but I'm going to join the military, I'm going to serve the country, I'm going to get these great benefits, I'm probably not going to go abroad. That all changed after 9/11. And they all went abroad, and it was like, what the heck? So I think that the draft would then put it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing in my mind, because it would link politicians. It would make them more accountable for what they decide to do. Just like if there was a balanced budget amendment, we're going to use military force and we have to levy a tax now to pay for that, the U.S. would never go to war, right? But the U.S. hasn't paid for a war or the military since the mid-1960s. We just issue more debt, and China buys the debt. Russia used to buy the debt. Saudi Arabia buys the debt. But I mean, so I think there's discussion about it. I can't see how that would come about. It would be such an allergen for the public, right? But a great question.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. In the back. Thank you.
Are disruptors like Palantir and rural housing having a tangible impact on the battlefield, or is it mostly just marketing at the moment, would you say? Because you sound very pessimistic, just sort of describing it as a tech add-on, basically.
As a what? No, I think they will be. No, I don't mean it that way. I mean, I think that it's if we're talking about Palantir on the battlefield now, I think that's more of an indicator of a revolutionary change. And I haven't thought about this enough, but that's where I'm going after this. I get this paper kind of finalized. And I mentioned the space paper. It's what are the implications of this? And the U.S. doesn't necessarily. I mean, I think we'll also uptake the commercial elements of it. We also have so much national capacity. We're a little less reliant on it, but the Ukrainians didn't. So they're making extensive use of it. And then the AI, we've heard varying things, right? But apparently it's in there to help speed up the kill chain and basically process all, because you've got all this data you're collecting, how do you process it? And that's where the AI comes in, which is still, I think, at the early stages. But, the way which processing changes and computing is it's exponential, right? So it's 2, then it's 4, then it's 8, then it's 16, then it's 32, and it's 64. It's not linear, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And so I think that's what we might be at the 16 stage of commercialization and AI, and next it'll be 32, then 64, then 100. So it just, I do think it'll revolutionize stuff. And then there's just a lot of implications for how does that relate to, if they target those assets. Is that part of the war or not, right? I mean, this was whatever you think of Elon Musk, that was, I think, part of what his concern was too, is wait a minute, we're actually actively aiding in this war, and does that mean we're a legitimate, and they are under international law a legitimate target. Why the Russians haven't really targeted the space, it's not SpaceX, it's the other one, Starlink, but they could, right? So I do think it will. I think we're on the cusp of revolution, which is why I say still. But I think we're getting there, right? And I think if we learn the lessons, then there will be revolutionary change. But that's the question: will it continue to be pop words, or will it actually lead to real reformation? And there will be a lot of pushback against this too, right? Because this then is about your defense priorities, your procurement plans, and that'll mean some things lose, some things win, and everyone's going to dislike that, right? So the Air Force the U.S. Air Force thought it was at the top because the drones are an Air Force technology, right? Actually, drones aren't. We're going to see both the Navy having its own drones and the Army having drones. They do already have them, but they're really integrated into the force, right? And so I think there's going to be a lot of pushback against change because services don't actually. They say they do, but they don't. There's a lot of my piece of the pie. And that's the question, is like even our notion of distinct services and jointness. I mean, we could go a little crazy here, right? But think about, and then even the cyber command and space command. Well, actually, aren't they all linked? I mean, this is constantly relying on space-based tech. So we've created another service, but it's kind of a 20th century way of thinking. I don't know if we want to go wholesale Canada. I'm not advocating that, but just I think there's a lot of, and that's what you need to do is think about it a lot more, I think. And I'm not sure we have as much of that as we used to have in the past. Like a lot of the folks who used to think about this have died away. Colin Gray and Martin van Crefeld was aging out. I think a lot of thinkers of this, it's not cool to think about war anymore. It's kind of bad.
Yeah, perhaps just as a follow-on, I mean, I think, adopting many of the products and the solutions they're offering is fairly inevitable because it's mostly focused around, automation and AI, which is key for solving the manpower issues you're describing. And then perhaps I would also maybe just like talk a bit about Helsing. Like their whole strategy is about emphasizing that it's always the human making like the final decision before
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just the artificial intelligence making
Yeah.
the right decision. So I think in that sense they're trying to preempt regulation. The view is always very eager to overregulate everything. So I think they are thinking very actively about how to avoid.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not one of those end killer robot people. I just don't think it's realistic, but I also don't think that that's the. Again, we'll see what happens. But I think you're exactly right. I think they're trying to. I mean, if you do a good job of supposedly regulating yourself or showing that you have better, you've thought this through, then there's less of a chance that you'll be regulated, right, or overly regulated. But when you don't, at least in the U.S. especially, then if you're grossly incompetent, then the government starts to come in and say, wait a minute. Of course, they don't know what they're doing either. This is the other problem. Is that if you watch some of these Senate hearings, just talk about domestic civilian technology, they have no idea. Like they don't know how their phones work, right? So how are they supposed to regulate, draw up battlefield agreements? But this is the same thing too. The military doesn't. I mean, the DoD doesn't really have the tech capacity it needs, and the DoD can't pay what the civilians can pay. There's these defense incubators. Diana at NATO. There's some out on the west coast of the U.S. where they're trying to partner. But the other challenge we're running into, I mean, I think it'll somehow even out. But people who are working for tech companies don't necessarily want their tech to be applied to the defense space.
Yeah.
So this creates a lot of different challenges. And even early on, we saw this with like cloud computing and people working at like Google and Amazon. They didn't want their systems being used to facilitate warfare. So I think that's kind of all stuff to be eked out. But I think the commercialization of warfare is something we're going to see increasingly see. Not exactly sure how it'll play out, but I think it'll happen.
I was also just thinking the 1975 Aslamar conference is a very interesting case study about how industry can self-regulate.
Which one? The F-35?
The 1975 Aslamar conference.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that was biotech self-regulating to avoid excessive regulation because there was a lot of public concern about it. But I think the same thing will happen for AI because there was also I think a 2018 SLMR conference on AI which tried to replicate.
Yeah. I think that's what I agree.
Yeah.
Good. I saw a hand up in the back there. Let's do a couple more, yeah? While we have time. Yeah. Good.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was a question I had on something that's been mentioned a couple of times that I just wanted to expand on a little bit and potentially keying into the theme of revolution as well. What role do you see space holding in the future of warfare as maybe a new frontier for warfare? And could you expand on the notion of Article 5 in space, how that would work? and also how space warfare would fit into this sort of Mosaic doctrinal approach, where sort of communicational vulnerability is sort of so key to the approach, and obviously communication is key with space.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think if you were in a, and this is again a lot of things to think about here. I think if you're talking about like total war, I mean, this is a question, are we also in a, I mean, I think the thing with Ukraine is, I view Ukraine as a pretty defined battle space, and although the US administration has been very worried about escalation, I think the Russians, although they keep bluffing, which to me then of course at a certain point you should really stop believing those bluffs, but I don't think the administration does that. But they also have shown that they don't want this to go wild. So I think the Russians, for what it's worth, have been pretty disciplined and in some ways, not in all ways, at keeping the battle space defined, because they could be going after stuff in outer space. I do think if you were to see a broader peer-peer conflict, right, like with the US and China, then you would see targeting of space-based assets. And the Chinese have been working on this. We know that, right? They've destroyed satellites in space. So have the Russians. So, you know, I don't know if we have weapons in space. I can neither confirm nor deny. But, you know, I think that I think you'll see that in a total war. But again, I think states are actually want to try and limit warfare. Like, because we tend to think of war as an aberration, but it's really not. And it's kind of a tool. And so in order for it to have some utility, you sort of have to try and limit it. And so I don't know if that imperative will limit what happens in space. I do think Article 5 applies in space. You could make a very convincing argument it doesn't apply in space. I would argue it does apply. I mean, you know, because NATO used to, for example, like in the Cold War, if a NATO warship was attacked by like not by a Russian force somewhere else on the planet, it didn't count, right? It wasn't Article 5 triggering, right? So you could say, well, a satellite in space, it's not in NATO territory, it doesn't count for Article 5. But it's 2024, right? And all of those space-based assets, no matter where they are in orbit, are necessary for, like, say, defense of Europe. So I would argue from that legally, and there's a bunch of stuff we could talk about, but that you've got the law in place to basically say that, you know, if a satellite was attacked, that would trigger Article 5. But NATO doesn't have any. I mean, everything's sort of ad hoc and consensus-based, and there's not any real procedure in place to deal with space, which is why I'm working on this piece with my student. But people are starting to write about it, but I think that's exactly where we need to go. And then the question is the commercialization of space. So if it's a US satellite or a British satellite or an EU satellite, that's one thing. But what if they take out a Starlink satellite? Does that trigger Article 5, or does that trigger a national military response, even if not Article 5? Does the U.S. defend it, or does you know, do you just sort of look the other way? If they target a Starlink satellite helping Ukrainian forces, that's one thing. What if you have forces that are utilizing the commercial technology, as I've kind of posited would be happening? I mean, they are. That's what the training they're doing. They're working on now, is they're utilizing these small command posts, are utilizing commercial technology. So then do you step in? You know, that's again, and then there's different historical, obviously you have to draw, they're not exact parallels, but you know, like if a commercial company invests in technology, puts it up there, and it gets targeted, you know, historically, the US has historically defended civilian placement of like stuff in colonial enterprises abroad. Britain historically didn't necessarily the same. It was a private enterprise that didn't defend it in the colonial era, right? So there's some difference there way back in history. So you could make a case that actually they chose to put that up there. It was targeted. That's part of the rules of the game. Sorry, Starlink, and we're off with it. But then again, if you're relying on it, right? So you could go. This is what we're trying to tease out. I think it does apply, and then the question will be to sort of kind of and. Our argument is for demarcation, because if you have clearer understanding, then it can kind of maybe cordon off some of that from attack, right? That's the idea, that would be a bridge too far. And so here's what you're thinking about. But I'm still thinking about that. So
thank you. That was really interesting.
Great. Let's do kind of last round of those who want to ask
lightning round.
Further questions,
Sure.
right? So we're getting second round of questions from those who asked before. Up front, go for it.
Yeah. So a question that I've been thinking about for a while is just using the Ukrainian case as an example, just how effective has the transmission effect been from tactical to operational to strategic when it comes to cost-efficient measures, right? Let's think of drones. You've got a T90M, $5 million to produce one-ish. You take a $20 Walmart drone, you strap a heat round on top of it, you hit the turret, and half of the crew is gone. Then the ammunition that detonates, tank is gone, right? So that clearly introduces a big question as to how to wage not only a tactical operation, but a broader scale, doctrinally speaking. Okay, you say that this hasn't been a revolution yet, so I assume that strategically speaking, so at the highest level of doctrine, this hasn't been implemented yet. But if then I think of your proposed change to brigades, right, like what you are doing effectively is that you're increasing the independent information capabilities per effective manpower unit. That's what you're doing, right? And so that, in a sense, would be a direct consequence of these new technologies being adapted, right? And so, yeah, I'm wondering, like, how effective have these cost-efficient considerations been implemented upwards from tactical, you know, from Conscriptovich playing with a drone to blow up a tank, all the way up to Gerasimov, let's say. How much has that happened? How do you see that moving forward? We're always fighting the old war, right? Exactly as he said. So, in a sense, it's good to be pessimistic about this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think your two questions kind of relate and answer. I mean, I think that it hasn't been, that's the whole point. This is where the Yemen angle comes in, which I dropped, and we got to go back to the China. I mean, look at what the US and the UK and others have been spending to intercept drone flights from Houthis with $1 million missiles, right? So it's not sustainable, right? But I think that we haven't gotten there yet. Like, we've not adapted. Okay, you see change in the field, but I haven't yet seen wholesale doctrinal change, say, in the Russian military. I think that the Ukrainians are definitely adapting, but I think it's super fluid. So that's the other thing. They're not busy writing doctrine. They're like fighting a war, right? So but I think they're on the cusp of it. That's what I'm saying is, like, I think this Mosaic, if we were to actually say, we're going to structure American Brigade Combat, that would kind of be more revolutionary than what we do now, right? So I think that's exactly the problem, is overcoming that cost discrepancy, right? And it's going to make weaker states or non-state actors, it increases their potency in various battle spaces because they're not spending a gajillion dollars, and then the whole procurement process, and then we don't have the capacity. So that's the other thing is, Jack Watling wrote about this at some point about slack capacity. So even if we wanted to spend the money, we don't have the capacity to ramp up production enough to counter all of this, which is why I think we're going to need doctrinal change, right? Because we're not going to be able to throw the systems into the field. Even if the U.S. could spend the money, we don't necessarily have that capacity either. We have more, and we did a better job. But then a lot of the capacity we're talking about too is actually less high-tech stuff. It's like munition shells, right? But then precision-guided munition shells as opposed to non-precision. So I don't think it's does that answer your question? I think it's not there. I don't think we're seeing it yet. But that's what I'm kind of arguing for.
And to what extent does this cost efficiency then increase the discrepancy between the tactical offense and tactical defense, right? Because if you're attacking, you need the tank to go there, right? I just need my drone with a strap bomb on top of it if I'm a defender and I'm hiding in a bush. Okay, which is not exactly what is happening, sure, but and so in my mind, at least, this is exponentially increasing the cost asymmetry between an offensive operation and a defensive operation. Does this then mean that we're moving to a more, hey, conquering a land is maybe a bit more expensive than you would think situation? Like, is that also being implemented strategically and maybe even diplomatic considerations?
Well, that would be the point of the deterrent element, right? So if you're thinking about strategic, I think you're right. I mean, there is this notion that, and I guess, I don't know, there was like, where does this 3-for-1 notion come from? I'm not really sure. It's really, but generally defense is a little easier than offense sometimes, right? You have an advantage, and you could be dug in or hidden as well. So I think that it does increase the cost of offense, and I think it does. For me, there's the deterrent. That's where it's more potent, is that the assumption that your superior conventional military, especially if it's unaugmented, right, or doctrinally not reformed, will do well in this environment, that's an error, right? And I think that's what again, and they've been inventing the whole time, but that's what the Ukrainians have basically settled on, which is why I sort of stalemated. I'm a little cautious about the stalemate notion because I think that Ukraine is on the weaker side here, and again, the manpower issues come up, but I do think it raises the cost. And the whole point is that, I mean, if Putin had realized how difficult this was going to be in the beginning, when he wouldn't have probably done it, right? Or he would have just gone for just the Eastern, but he didn't. And that's but then there's other things about information awareness and like, so this is the whole thing of like, here's what we have, you don't want to do it, right? And so, to get the strategic level effect. But I do think he had thought, that but this is always the challenge. I mean, I point this out too, people hate it, but the US made the same mistake, right? I mean, similar mistakes. In 2003, Shinseki said we need 400,000 troops to oust the regime and then stabilize the country. And the higher ups in the administration were like, no, we don't. We only need 2,000 troops. You're fired, right? And this is what we're going to do. So, and that was in a democracy where you've got information sharing and critical press. And to me, it's not surprising that Putin, I mean, you fall out a window if you're going to criticize Putin. So, and very few people knew what was really going on. So it makes sense why he blundered into this. But that's the thing, is telegraphing it. But even when you kind of know, this is a separate topic now, but decision makers could just make bad decisions. Like, the decision makers in the W. Bush administration made bad decisions about force employment. If they had put in 400,000 troops and had a better force to space ratio, probably not dissolve the Iraqi military, probably would have gone very differently, right? So it does matter. But I think that the deterrent elements, people will think twice about attacking if they are aware that but again, then who's going to have these capabilities and what capabilities? And you just have to have both sides of that coin. So I think they're like,
Okay, we're going to do last round, yeah?
yeah, sure.
Together
Let's
up here,
take a bunch
in the
and then
back,
go
once
back.
again, up here once again. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we'll just do 3.
Sure. All
And
right.
then
All
there's
right.
2 more after, but
You-
we'll
you
see.
go ahead.
Who did I go first? In the back, yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because, I mean, wouldn't it sort of just be a fool's errand to strike like a Starlink satellite, because it's a massive constellation, so they have a lot of redundancy, and it's also very low cost. I mean, Starship is making it extremely low cost to send up a new set of satellites. The same for drones, and they've basically sort of eliminated the possibility for air superiority as well. So I'm just sort of wondering, I mean, isn't it like the thinking that, striking like a satellite would trigger Article 5? I mean, it's not sort of anachronistic. I mean, the nature of warfare has changed quite substantially. It's very low cost and very easy to, produce all of these sort of instruments of warfare, I would say.
Yep. Okay. That's one. Do you want down here?
Up here,
Yeah, sort of follow-on question from the 2 questions to like my left, your right. Again on Mosaic Warfare. So are we still on the key assumption that we're fighting the war on our terms there? Because it strikes me that a lot of Western doctrine, if we talk about Iraq, Afghanistan in the past, has always relied on air superiority, relied on a non-peer-on-peer enemy. And is it that this new Mosaic and the way it's being talked about in the American spheres, which you have access to, is that, could we give that to the Ukrainians and say this will unlock what you're currently stuck in, i.e. your trench warfare, or is it that actually we've still got aspirational and really we would only do that if we have air superiority and that we're fighting the war very much on a Western terms?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. Was there one more?
Okay.
So, Dr. Michael, my question is about the future of war based on the current wars happening in Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon. What does that tell us about the future of war?
Oh no, I was trying to go somewhere else. My standard reply is I work on Cold War Europe. All right, so 3 great questions. I think you're right. My response would be 2 things. One, I think it's a theorist or a strategist trying to think about all the possibilities. But I do think you're right? So I think it doesn't make, I think you're going to see more electronic warfare in the jamming of the, right, than you would taking down the actual asset in space. But it doesn't mean it's not worth thinking through, if this was happening, what would our response be, right? But I don't disagree with you. It could be all of the above, right? I think that's the problem, is like when you have like a best case assumption, like they'll never do, I mean, because again, like 15 years ago, no one thought that howitzers and tanks were necessary. I mean, the Dutch military got rid of all of their tanks and they partnered with the Germans to retain some capacity. So if they wanted to bring their tankers back, they could. So Dutch tankers, the men still exist. They train with German units, right? But they got rid of them all. So it was like, no, we don't need main battle tanks. And now suddenly here we are in 2024, and even if they're reduced in many ways, they're more susceptible, there's still a big component of what's happening. Artillery too, still a big component. So that's why I think it's worth thinking through all these, but I don't disagree. I think and that's why the Mosaic concept, I think it's really more about, they're just gonna leave those up there and try to interfere at this level, right? Rather than targeting the assets, because that gets into a lot of stuff about overt weaponization of space, and right? So, and I think, again, call me crazy, but I do think states want to keep war in the realm of to be utilized. Like, it's a tool. People like, think it's an anthem. I don't know, war, but it's a tool for states. And if they go too far in one direction, everything falls apart, which we've seen in the past with total war. So I think people want limited war. So it's electronic warfare based. Your question, I don't think it does. And again, the air superiority still does matter, I think, for Mosaic Warfare. I mean, at least that's what we've seen now. Air superiority does matter. And I would say that the inability of one side to achieve air superiority has also been, that's why I'm kind of arguing what we're seeing now is not revolutionary. So I don't think, if Russia had air superiority, I think Ukraine would have probably collapsed by now. Their military defense would have. So does Mosaic Warfare, is it predicated on air dominance? I would argue it is, but would hopefully be more resilient if you were to be in a more contested space. What I have to think through more, and I don't know how much it's been thought, it's kind of quite abstract. So how does Mosaic Warfare apply to the defense of NATO? That's, I think, kind of the question here, right? How does it apply to, say, defending the Baltics and whatnot? And no one's really teased that out, and that's something, so again, that would assume a contested airspace, I think, but trying to achieve air superiority. But I think also it would, part of what you try to do there is that those frontline units would be able to disperse and probably harass more so on a defensive. And this is the strategic level to say, look, like, you're going to try and go after them. It's going to be very painful, even if there's a fallback. I mean, because Baltics don't like to hear that, but the current, and obviously the plans are all secret. But I was at NATO all last fall on a Fulbright, and then looking at the military balance. So I'm pretty sure our defense of the Baltics is actually predicated on fallback and retake, just like it was in the Cold War. So maybe how does Mosaic fit into that? I don't know, but I think that the air power remains a critical component, and I think that's where we're actually thinking about, is it a European land, because where are we going to fight a major land war with a peer competitor? It's probably here. China won't be a major land war. I think that's going to be mostly an air and sea battle. And then if you're thinking about risk management, like deploying forces to other combat zones for stabilization, or then, how does this, I would argue actually it probably translates a little better onto the insurgency thing than the centralized hierarchical structure that we've tried to employ. It actually kind of overlays, right? A little more entrepreneurial. The final question, I don't want to, I'm gonna get in trouble now. So, that's a tough one. What does it say about future war? Yes. What does it say? So a couple of things. I mean, again, it's like such a fraud.
It's a safe space.
A safe space. I mean, I think though, that's a difficult one. I mean, countries, I guess I would bring it back to, how do you win a war? You don't win a war by winning battles. The U.S. won most of its battles, I think, in Vietnam, but we lost the war. The Germans in the Second World War won more battles. The German military was arguably superior to all the Allied forces, and it did take the combined forces of Britain, the United States, and the entire Soviet Union, which lost millions of people, soldiers and civilians, to wear down the Germans. Right? Someone was saying, there was some joke, something, who is the best at fighting force? Oh, well, the Nazis clearly were. And they're like, what are you crazy? Like, no, I mean, they clearly were, right? So winning battles is not how you win a war. You win a war by, and this is where we get to the strategic level and the tactical employment of force. Like, we have this whole Afghanistan War Commission now in the U.S. A friend of mine is on it. We're trying to figure out what went wrong. How did the military fail? And I was like, why? It's a really simple answer to me. Like, you try to use military force to build a country from the ground up, and you're wondering why it didn't go well. I mean, this is like a issue of state development, centralized authority, taxation. I mean, modernity, modernization. It's like 200 years of it's a really simple answer. Stupid use of force employment. There's a lot to dissect there, right? The initial campaign was one thing. Rumsfeld never wanted to stay in Afghanistan. the U.S. and NATO ended up in Afghanistan on the back end because of Europe, because they didn't want to participate in the war. So these things, we tend to drop all this off, but that's really obvious why that was such a terrible failure, right? And I worked in Afghanistan a lot. I was in and out of there for 8 years. So it's like very close to my heart and very sad, but also I could tell you stories. So just a mess. Like it was a completely unrealistic like goal with like what you're trying to do, whether that's military force, development aid, everything. It's just, I did all these studies for the cabinet unit as a train wreck. So what's your goal and how do you achieve it? And it's not always through military force. And I think that you really win by convincing people to surrender or that they've been defeated, which means you need to give them a space to be defeated, especially defeated with honor. And part of what happened, if you go back to the Second World War, is that the Nazis on the Eastern Front, and actually Christopher Coker wrote about this in his book Humane Warfare. He was my mentor. Hope you're doing all right up there. He had said that he wrote about this in detail. The Nazis left no space for the Soviets to surrender. By the way, that was an easy win because the Soviet Union was terrible, right? And some of these guys were fighting without guns, just go. Again, it was this meat grinder warfare. But the Soviets, when they captured Soviets, the Germans would make them read Pravda. And if you could read Pravda, they put you in one group, and if you couldn't, they put you in another group. And the group that could read, they executed. That's a violation of the Geneva Conventions. And the other group, they put into forced labor camps. So why would you surrender if you think surrendering is not better than dying, right? And so I think that goes back to like, what's the objective of the war in Gaza or that broader war? Urban combat operations are very difficult. I'll say that. And I think Israel has 100% right to respond to the October 7th attacks. I'm not entirely sure that their military strategy matches any sort of strategic outcome that's useful for them. And I also, where we don't like, as someone who wrote a book on international law and war, I would say I'm being gracious when saying that the laws of war have been bent greatly in this conflict. And that, of course, leaves no one a space for surrender. Like, what's the point of surrendering? And the war doesn't look to me like, I'm gonna get in so much trouble. When you look at the government, not the whole country, but when you look at what this government says and how they're conducting the war, they don't leave in my mind much space for understanding, right? And I think when someone tells you who they are, believe them. And I think that the way they've conducted this war demonstrates what they want from this war. And it's by the way, it's not in line with U.S. policy, but U.S. policy hasn't mattered for 20 years on this issue because it's completely ignored. So I'm not really sure what our U.S. strategy is vis-a-vis Israel. I think I know what the Israeli strategy, this government's strategy is. But I don't think it's, but I think it goes down to this notion of, at the end of the day, technology won't save you. So for all the stuff we're talking about, I still think it comes down to manpower and force employment. And that's what I think they actually saw in terms of, they thought technology could keep them safe on October 7th. They couldn't. I don't know if you were. I was shocked to find out they had this whole border completely unmanned. Of course, they were unmanned because they had their units in illegally occupied territories rather than deployed on their border. So I think there's a lot of lessons you could draw there about that conflict. But I don't think that they're waging a counterinsurgency in a way, if we want to call it that generously, that will fix the problem for them in the long run. And I think that they'll be fighting the same problem 20 years from now. Because it doesn't, and you could look, I'll stop here, but you could look to Northern Ireland and how that conflict was eventually resolved. It wasn't through the application of increasingly brute force upon the population in Northern Ireland. With that, thank you all for coming. Yeah. Thank you very much.